Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm president of Bay Area Skeptics. Our speaker tonight is noted archaeologist Dr. John Hoops, professor of anthropology at Kansas University. He received his PhD from Harvard University and has spent the majority of his academic career at KU. His academic specialty is archaeology of pre-Spanish indigenous cultures of Central America and Northern South America, and he has conducted fieldwork in Costa Rica, Eastern New Mexico, and coastal Ecuador. His long-term research looks at the interaction of indigenous peoples of this region regarding subsistent social organization and ideology. But we as skeptics are particularly interested that, as Dr. Hoops wrote in his bio at KU, quote, the role of archaeology in pop culture and contemporary mythology with a special focus on pseudoscience, pseudoarchaeology, and counterculture narratives. In that light, he's been a vigorous, maybe even fierce critic of the work of one Graham Hancock, a writer and provocateur who for many years now has promoted a number of, shall we say, questionable opinions about archaeology. Recently, Graham Hancock's 6-part documentary, hope you heard the quotation marks there, has been featured on Netflix and has received wide popular exposure. According to TV Guide, Ancient Apocalypse was the second most watched series on Netflix during the week of its release and has remained in the top 10 for several weeks thereafter. Many of the claims made in this documentary are made about sites and cultures in Mesoamerica, which makes Dr. Hoops a particularly apt choice to discuss the problems with the series and its claims. I will leave it to John to fill in the details, but suffice to say that there is plenty of conspiracy theorizing to go around. Stuart Heritage of The Guardian mused in his review about the series about who exactly this series appeals to, noted that in the sizzle reel, quote, we are treated to a clip of the show's host, Graham Hancock, being interviewed by Joe Rogan. Finally, we have an answer. Ancient Apocalypse must be a TV program made exclusively for people who like to shout at you on Twitter. John, welcome to Bay Area Skeptics. And I promise you we will not be shouting at you at all.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. I really appreciate it. And I thoroughly expect to wake up in the morning to lots of shouting at me on Twitter.
I think that is entirely the possibility that you will be facing, yes.
But contrary to the claims of concealing information from the public, I love to engage with the public and would be happy to answer people's questions on Twitter or other social media.
Well, you do have a very active Twitter account now that we have become Twitter friends. I'm aware of that. And I will encourage any of our viewers today to take advantage of that possibility. Now, let's just get right into it. Let's hear what you have to say, because I, for one, am very much looking forward to your views of this ancient apocalypse and its creator. Take it away, John.
Thanks very much. Well, welcome to the Skeptic Talk tonight. I am going to be speaking not about Central American archaeology so much, not about my areas of archaeological science, but rather putting things into context. And the people who I'm doing this for are those who are sitting on the fence. True believers are very difficult to persuade. Either way, if you are not an open-minded person, this talk is probably not for you. But if you are open-minded, I'm hoping that you will learn some new things. And it's very good that this talk is being recorded because I'm going to be giving you lots and lots of resources. So please bookmark this YouTube video and come back to it because you'll find it to be a very good reference. Typically, these talks don't include bibliographies, but I'm going to be talking about lots of books tonight. I'm also going to be discussing a topic that is a little bit different from some of those that Jeannie Scott and other skeptics have been dealing with. We've all had our share of dealing with creationists and scientific creationists, and we know how difficult it is sometimes to reconcile both sides. But tonight I'm going to be talking about not creationism, but a different topic. And in particular, I'm going to be discussing something that is a new term that I've coined specifically for this talk. It actually came to me this morning while I was driving to work. And I thought, well, I'm not talking about scientific creationism. What I'm going to be talking about is scientific occultism. Now, of course, that scientific is in quotes, but let me tell you what scientific occultism is. It implies that knowledge or the truth is intentionally hidden or occult. It represents a theosophical synthesis of science and spirituality. It claims that this reality can be confirmed by science, which is what makes it quote unquote scientific. And it emphasizes the metaphysical over the physical, with an emphasis on gnosis, mysticism, and revelation, which is what apocalypse means, is a revelation. The value of emotion and intuition. How do you know that this is true? You just know. It also relies upon the transmission of wisdom by timeless adepts and supernatural masters, in which the power of mind is more important, in which there is a power of mind over material. Scientific occultism is characterized by a belief in the persistence of disembodied consciousness, such as past lives and reincarnation, the permanence of the soul. It also pulls upon perennialism, this notion of a cyclical as opposed to a linear cosmology. It's characterized by belief in lost lands, like Atlantis and Lemuria, or an advanced lost civilization. And it pulls upon eclectic sources in esotericism. Among the most salient characteristics of scientific occultism is a belief in psi, psychic phenomena, telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, and also acceptance of the paranormal. It also values altered states of consciousness, such as one might experience under the influence of powerful psychedelics. And essentially is attempting to explore that which was and is and will ever be, that no mortal has yet lifted the veil to be able to see. Dealing with pseudoscience is a bit like the story of Brer Rabbit and the Tar Baby. The more you wrestle with it, the more entangled you can become. And so I'm heading into some dangerous territory here because I fully expect that I'll be spending my next few weeks discussing some of these ideas, hopefully on Twitter with some of you. But one of the most important things to know is that pseudoarchaeology and pseudoscience is not a bad thing. In fact, many of the principal archaeologists who worked in Mexico and Central America were inspired by pseudoscience. Sylvanus Morley was inspired by H. Rider Haggard. Michael Coe was a fan of H.P. Lovecraft. And Linda Sheely, the decipherer of Maya hieroglyphic writing, was an incredible Trekkie. All of this fantasy and science fiction fuels this interest and fuels this passion and fuels this knowledge. But pseudoarchaeology is a real problem today. On channels like Gaia.com, you have dozens, if not hundreds, of videos about forbidden archaeology and ancient aliens and the mystery of the Sphinx and all of these speculative nonfiction is the best way to refer to it. There are publishing houses like Inner Vision's Baron Company, which publishes books on ancient mysteries about ancient giants, secrets of the ancient Americas, mysteries of the caves, the empires of Atlantis. I think you have a sense of what this type of stuff is, but there's quite a lot of it out there. And of course, there are the personalities. You may recognize many of these faces. They're ones that good skeptics have been looking at for a long time. Some of them are cable television stars. Others are authors and writers. But all of these individuals have contributed in one way or another to fostering the growth of what I refer to as a cultic milieu, which I'll explain in a little bit. There are tours, there are talks, there are conferences. There's an entire social network on social media. There are websites, there are publishers, all of whom are supporting this particular body of knowledge. And there are lots of them. One group on Facebook called Ancient Origins has 1.2 million members. And if you haven't yet heard of the Mud Flood or the Tartarian Empire, that's a very deep and slippery and muddy rabbit hole to go down. But this one group on Facebook has 63,000 members who are discussing these topics, which I'm not going to get into tonight. There are also my colleagues who are combating pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology on a daily basis. One of my heroes is Kenny Fader, who first wrote Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology in 1990. His book is now in its 10th edition, published by Oxford University Press, and it's one of the best resources for reading about pseudoarchaeology, which is the interpretation of the ancient past using techniques other than science. This is an excerpt from Graham Hancock's last book called America Before, published in 2019. And I'm going to read you this passage. Hancock writes, "My speculation, which I will not attempt to prove here or support with evidence, but merely present for consideration, is that the advanced civilization I see evolving in North America during the Ice Age had transcended leverage and mechanical advantage and learned to manipulate matter and energy by deploying powers of consciousness that we have not yet begun to tap. In action, such powers would look something like magic even today, and must have seemed supernatural and godlike to the hunter-gatherers who shared the Ice Age world with these mysterious adepts. Telepathy, telekinesis, remote viewing, and healing powers are, of course, all capabilities believed to be within the repertoire of master shamans. Indeed, ayahuasca, which lies at the heart of Amazonian shamanism, first entered Western consciousness under the name telepathy." And actually, it's William S. Burroughs who went to the Putumayo region of Colombia in search of telepathy back in the 50s. Well, Ancient Aliens is now in its 19th season, but there are messages in Ancient Aliens that I think are a little bit problematic, including implications that people of color were not able to accomplish, the building of pyramids, the creation of ancient civilizations, and a whole host of other things. This is a really dark side of Ancient Aliens. The truth, of course, is something different. They're not UFOs. Well, maybe. Who knows? We're still investigating. I want to talk a little bit about my own entry into this area. When I was in junior high, I was a collector of weird shitology. It's a word that we use for weird shit, weird books about the weird. And one of the first that I collected was by Frank Edwards, who wrote Stranger Than Science, with mysteries that were so strange that science cannot even explain them, such as a man who disappeared in full view of his family and is never seen again, as well as the atomic explosion of a spaceship in 1908, also known as the Tunguska event in Siberia, the Hindu girl who lived twice, reincarnation, the giant who lifted an anchor weighing 2,200 pounds, and the man with the X-ray mind. Here for pure enjoyment and fascinating reading is a book guaranteed to stir the imagination. I also read books by Edgar Cayce. And how did he do in terms of his prophecies? Well, let's see. How did Edgar Cayce accurately predict 2 world wars in the years that they would begin and end, racial strife in America, the death of JFK, and hundreds of other recorded events? Now we dare believe these prophecies for the future. The destruction of most of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. The end of communism in Russia, with a liberated Soviet in alliance with the USA becoming the hope of the world. Well, no, that one didn't quite turn out. And the resurrection of the lost continent of Atlantis, which Edgar Cayce prophesied would occur in 1968. Hence, a very popular song by the Scottish musician Donovan, who sang a song about Atlantis. The continent of Atlantis was an island which lay before the Great Flood in an area we now call the Atlantic Ocean. So great an area of land that from her western shores, these beautiful sailors journeyed to the south and the North Americas with ease in their ships with painted sails. To the east, Africa was her neighbor, across a short strait of sea miles. The great Egyptian age is but a remnant of the Atlantean culture. The antediluvian kings colonized the world. All the gods who play in the mythological dramas and all legends from all lands were from fair Atlantis. Knowing her fate, Atlantis sent out ships to all corners of the earth. On board were the 12, the poet, the physician, the farmer, the scientist, the magician, and the other so-called gods of our legends, though gods they were. And as the elders of our time choose to remain blind, let us rejoice and let us sing and dance and ring in the new. Hail Atlantis. Way down below the ocean, where I want to be, she may be. Now, if you listen to this song, at the very end of the song, Donovan sings these three phrases: wake up, wake up, wake up. It's a call for wokeness, which I interpret as a reference to George Gurdjieff, who said that we need to wake up to a new reality, a different reality, a reality that includes this occult reality. Well, this song, Atlantis, made the pop charts and hit #1 when I was 9 years old. But Graham Hancock, who was born in 1950, was 18 years old. And I think that this particular song planted some seeds in the consciousness of his generation, along with some other subconscious messages. Yellow Submarine came out that same year, and many people may not realize that Pepperland is Atlantis. The Yellow Submarine is the land beneath the sea. And the pyramid on which the Yellow Submarine was parked was modeled on the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, Mexico. So even in 1968, seeds are being planted for this occult reality. Well, something else in my own consciousness was the fact that my mother was a Rosicrucian. And we had a lot of Rosicrucian literature in the house that referred to ancient wisdom. In fact, I was so taken with this that I was fascinated by music and other types of things associated with ancient Egypt. This was my favorite record album in 1973. And what you see on the right is the back of a shirt that I embroidered. And actually, ironically, the song on the B side of Donovan's hit song was I Love My Shirt. Well, I had a shirt that had this Egyptian design on the back of it. I was into this stuff 50 years ago. This is 1973. I was reading books like James Churchward's Lost Continent of Mu, which some of you may recognize. And I was also listening to albums like Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans, which had cover art by Roger Dean, which if you look at very closely, you can see archaeoastronomy, the pyramid at Chichen Itza, and if you look very carefully, even one of the geoglyphs from the Nazca lines. Well, in 1973, I was busy writing my very first research paper in my life for a 10th grade English class. And I kid you not, the title of this paper was Atlantis, the Seat of Man. I confess, I was an Atlantis believer when I was 14 years old. I finished the paper in January of 1974 when I had just turned 15. And so this is something that I've been occupied with for quite a long time. When I got to graduate school, I worked for Professor Stephen Williams in developing the first course ever taught in American university focused on pseudoarchaeology. It was called Fantastic Archaeology. I began that job in 1982, and I was a teaching assistant for the course, which hundreds of Harvard students took. And then more recently, as a result of all of this interest in archaeology and the weird, I became very interested in the whole 2012 phenomenon. And over 10 years ago and more, actually going all the way back, almost 20 years, I began researching this interest in the Maya calendar and the coming apocalypse, and contributed a chapter to the book on the left. And if you're interested, I also in October recorded episode 39 of the Tales from Atlantis podcast called Remembering the Maya Apocalypse, in which I discuss what is it that we learned from looking back on this whole phenomenon a long time ago, 10 years ago, in fact. I also was a consultant to Douglas Preston in his book, Lost City of the Monkey God, where I played the role of the skeptic. And in fact, I was quite critical of the project and am the critic who's featured in the film version Lost City of the Monkey God, which aired on the Science Channel on Halloween in 2021. I also teach a course called Archaeological Myths and Realities, in which the core text that we begin with is Carl Sagan's The Demon-Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark, which teaches students scientific method and also how to recognize logical fallacies and how to use Carl Sagan's baloney detection kit, which is quite useful in approaching ancient apocalypse and all of this material. Well, I mentioned the term cultic milieu, a term that was coined by sociologist Colin Campbell. And in his book, A Culture of Conspiracy, Michael Barkun explains how cults emerge out of a supportive social and ideological environment, which he calls the cultic milieu, which includes all deviant belief systems, not merely those that find their way into occultism, though the occult remains a major component of the cultic milieu. There is, in other words, a world of persons, organizations, social interactions, and channels of communication that make the cultic milieu a genuine subculture rather than a mere intellectual or religious phenomenon. Some of the most important references that you can look at for understanding this scientific occultism include works by James Webb, which is a critical evaluation of the occult underground. The Only Tradition by William Quinn, published in 1997, which for me is the most complete exposition on traditionalism from the perspective, the emic perspective of a believer. And then just last year, Wouter Hanegraaff published his excellent book, Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination, which is winning all kinds of awards, and I would really recommend it as something that you consult. Well, among the concepts that are important for understanding this cultic milieu and scientific occultism are notions of the philosophia perennis, the perennial philosophy, something that was articulated most completely by Aldous Huxley in his book. And among the principles of the perennial philosophy are the notion of the unity of all things, the illusion of time and the intemporal present, that time is an illusion and things happen in the past and in the future simultaneously. As above, so below, which is an alchemical tenet, as well as the necessity of opposites and their embeddedness in each other, notions of yin and yang, death and rebirth, as well as cause and effect, karma and balance. But one of the most important elements of the perennial philosophy is this notion of intuition, pure intellect, which is the truth, and the role of the enlightened elite is to understand this gnosis and communicate it. According to comparative religious historian Mircea Eliade, the history of religions can play an essential role in this effort towards the planetization of culture. It can contribute to the elaboration of a universal type of culture, which ultimately becomes one of the programs and goals of the perennial philosophy. I'm going to quickly go through some of the components of esotericism based on the work of Antoine Favre, and I really recommend this book as an excellent source. But some of these may be familiar to you. I've already mentioned of as above, so below. Another element is the notion of symbolic reality. Everything is a sign and hides a secret. The notion of anima, that nature is alive in all of its parts. The existence of a magia naturalis, the magic links in all things in the natural world, magia naturalis. The mundus imaginalis, the mesocosm of the imagined world. Imagine is what allows for gnosis, a seeing and knowing of correspondences, and understanding this magia naturalis. There's also the notion of transmutation, which comes from alchemy, a metamorphosis, illumination, unification, a mixing and combining of things to create new things. The praxis of concordance, which is the acquisition of gnosis in a primordial tradition, and the notion that knowledge passes from a master to a disciple. Gnosis abolishes a distinction between faith and knowledge. Faith is knowledge, which contributes to the salvation of the individual who experiences it. Theosophy is the idea that there's intentionality in the cosmos. It's a philosophy of nature in which revealed myth is used to evoke symbolic resonances by virtue of active imagination, often a narrative of origins. Alchemy and its principles, Hermeticism, is also an important part of this esotericism, and occultism has to do with the praxis, the practices that deal with specific investigations, such as astrology, magic, alchemy, conjuring, the various mancies, and all of these types of things. And perennialism is the belief in a common origin for all religions, a primordial, primeval knowledge, and the lineal transmission of this knowledge by elite mystical adepts across time, which is predominantly the notion of an awakening, the concept of constantly recreating the world, ultimately leading to new ages and a sequence of new ages. And an element of this is traditionalism, which is a concern with the study and revival of archaic knowledge for personal salvation and redemption of the modern world from this Kali Yuga, a destructive force. Well, all of this can be characterized as anti-modernism. And this notion of modernity and its problems is something that's articulated by the Italian writer Julius Evola and Mark Sedgwick, whose book I highly recommend, provides a background, historical background critique of what he refers to as the secret intellectual of the intellectual history, excuse me, the secret intellectual history of the 20th century, which is this anti-modernism trend. Well, I really believe that Ancient Apocalypse and what it represents is an anti-modernist approach, and that scientific occultism is a form of anti-modernism. Well, who is Graham Hancock, this author who is our host in Ancient Apocalypse? Well, there's a quote that I really enjoy from L. Sprague de Camp, who was writing a book called Lost Continents in 1954. It was ultimately reprinted in 1970. But he describes Ignatius Donnelly of the past century in a way that I think also applies to Graham Hancock. He writes, Ignatius Donnelly was a man with an extremely active mind, but possessing also that haste to form judgments and that lack of critical sense in testing them, which are often the result of self-education conducted by immense and unsystematic reading. I love that quote. Hancock has written a trilogy, Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, and most recently, America Before, which offer us the evidence of Earth's lost civilization, the forgotten wisdom of Earth's lost civilization, and the key to Earth's lost civilization, in all of which the principal model, the principal idea, is that there was an ancient advanced civilization on Earth that existed before the end of the Ice Age and was ultimately destroyed by a rain of comets that wiped it out, leaving only a few survivors to carry on its knowledge and traditions, and who are remembered as gods in the construction of pyramids around the world, and in the myths and legends that talk about these ancient adepts who brought wisdom, including information and knowledge about agriculture and mathematics and astrology and all kinds of other arts. Hancock has been very influential. In fact, it's his work that contributed to Roland Emmerich making these memorable films, The Day After Tomorrow, 10,000 BC, and also 2012. Graham Hancock was a big 2012 advocate. And he has really popped into the public's perception as a result of his appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience. In particular, if you look closely, you can see that this interview that he did shortly after the publication of America Before has so far had 22 million views. This is a huge impact on public consciousness and really brings this work from the fringe into the mainstream. In fact, it's one of the reasons I refer to it as mainstream pseudoarchaeology. This is something that was critiqued in a special issue of the SAA Archaeological Record that I edited for 2019. Came out in November. His book had come out in April, and it was because Graham Hancock had focused on the archaeology of the Americas that I felt it was important to give a good critical treatment to what it is that he published. And then we have Ancient Apocalypse, a series about the origins of ancient civilizations, which is being called the most dangerous show on Netflix because we've all gone insane. This is coming from Barstool Sports. In The Guardian, Stuart Heritage writes that the danger of a show like this whispers to the conspiracy theory in all of us. And Hancock is such a compelling host that he's bound to create a few more in his wake. Believing that ultra-intelligent creatures helped build the pyramids is one thing, but where does it end? believing that election fraud is real, believing 9/11 was an insider job. Worse, if you're feeling particularly mean-spirited, you could suggest that Netflix knows this and has gone out of its way to court the conspiracy theorists. Well, the central conspiracy theory of Graham Hancock is that archaeologists like me are hiding the truth from you. We don't want you to know the evidence for this ancient civilization, and his job is to reveal it. Authors like David Wengrow, whose book The Dawn of Everything is one that you might have read, writes that Graham Hancock's ideas actually draw sustenance from mainstream theories about social evolution that dominated archaeology and anthropology for much of the 20th century. He refers to simple hunter-gatherers to describe people of poor agriculture. But Wengrow writes that, albeit in extremely different ways, both approaches, the alternative and the mainstream, have stubbornly, systematically refused to accord past actors the capacity for social imagination and self-determination in the absence of overlords. That is, the idea is that the culture bringers are the ones who teach these humble hunters and gatherers how to do what it is that they're doing. I'm not going to read through all of these points, but I just wanted to make sure that you're aware that that professional skeptic Michael Shermer has weighed in Skeptic magazine in an article called Alternative Civilization and Its Discontents. And when you're watching the YouTube video, you can stop it and read his various points. Shermer makes some very good points about ancient apocalypse, but he's someone who's debated Hancock in the past and knows him quite well. Among the problems with ancient apocalypse is that it refers to these ancient adepts, these bringers of wisdom and culture, as bearded men in robes. The series does not mention the fact that in previous publications, Graham Hancock has identified these culture bringers as white Caucasians, which raises a concern that, in fact, the model that he's presenting is one that is drawing upon much earlier models of that, and here's the phrase that I like to use, that align with racism and white supremacy. I am not saying that Graham Hancock is a racist. I don't think that he is. I don't think that he's a white supremacist. But the models that have been presented are ones that racists and white supremacists will find attractive. And the source that he cites is a book called Fair Gods and Stone Faces that suggests that it was white people who were the culture bringers to these ancient places. Well, with these concerns, the Society for American Archaeology wrote an open letter to Netflix complaining about the show, trying to bring attention to the fact that it has these concerning elements of it, in which the host of the series repeatedly and vigorously dismisses archaeologists and the practice of archaeology with aggressive rhetoric, willfully seeking to cause harm to our membership and our profession in the public eye. Netflix also identifies the series as a docuseries, a genre that implies its content is grounded in fact when the content of the show is based on false claims about archaeologists and archaeology. And then lastly, the theory it presents has a long-standing association with racist, white supremacist ideologies, does injustice to indigenous peoples, and emboldens extremists. Well, the extremists were definitely emboldened. And Graham Hancock himself tweeted out that a friend kindly drew my attention to the more positive review from a US source that I had missed when it came out. Well, that positive review comes from the Daily Caller, an online magazine that was founded by Tucker Carlson of Fox News. And you can tell just from looking at these headlines where this is going. Ancient Apocalypse is a revolutionary, beautiful, a true, must-true series. Scream at Ancient Apocalypse at your own peril, illiberal idiots. Archaeologists call fun police on Netflix doc and hilariously hypocritical letter, the one from the SAA. And ultimately, Graham Hancock gives an epic response to those ignoring our vulnerability in the cosmos. Other right-wing pundits also came to Graham Hancock's defense, including Matt Walsh, author of What is a Woman?, a notorious anti-LGBTQ activist. He basically was saying, well, what's the big deal? This is free speech. Hancock should be able to say whatever it is that he wants. Interestingly, pretty much the only positive support that Graham Hancock is getting in this series is coming from known right-wing pundits, including Edward Dutton, who himself is, I think it's probably fair to say, an out-and-out racist. Leftists lose it over Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse, and why? And he writes, in daring to challenge that narrative, Hancock reminds leftists of what cowards they are. And in so much as they've worked hard for their academic credentials, they've followed the rules, as conscientious scientists do. They're furious that an outsider who has not followed the rules receives the fame that they believe they deserve. That is why ancient apocalypse has upset them. As for Hancock and his theories, about which I'm certainly unconvinced, and this is a really critical point, Dutton doesn't buy Hancock's arguments. He's not completely, he's not into the theory. But he says that instead of simply dismissing him as a racist and white supremacist and pseudo-archaeologist, let's just be open-minded. Well, Hancock, by me, has not been dismissed as a racist or a white supremacist. I do call him a pseudo-archaeologist, but I think Edward Dutton is missing the point. In response, Graham Hancock has challenged me to a debate, but I turned him down immediately. I just want to call your attention to the fact that Graham Hancock himself writes, John Hoops is better qualified than perhaps any other archaeologist to offer a solid, well-researched critique of my work. So welcome to that. We're having that this evening. My colleagues have risen to the occasion to respond and comment on what it is that's been happening in response to this show. Jason Colavito, who has an excellent website, is a long-term writer on pseudoarchaeology and pseudohistory, and his article for the New Republic is definitely worth reading. Jason is the author of Faking History. He also has compiled information on sources about Atlantis, sources about pyramidiates and pyramidology. But his most important books, which I really urge you to look at, are The Mound Builder Myth, Fake History and the Hunt for a Lost White Race, and also Legends of the Pyramids, in which Jason deconstructs the long history of misinterpretations of pyramids. Well, I'm not here to debunk ancient apocalypse. I'm not going to be doing that this evening. My colleagues have done a wonderful job of that, and you can find them online, on YouTube and elsewhere, with very detailed debunking of every single episode of Ancient Apocalypse, as well as commentary on the series as a whole. These include Kaylee During at History with Kaylee, and also Carl Fegans on the website ahotcupofjoe.net. One of the best presentations is by Milo Rossi, who just put this video on YouTube last week, and it has already had over 1 million views. I think Milo does a fantastic job, and he speaks to the younger generations. In fact, the millennials, the Gen Xers, the Gen Zers really seem to be enjoying Milo a lot. Well, where do these things stand in terms of Graham Hancock? Well, I turned down a debate with him because I simply am not interested in doing it. But my colleague Flint Dibble has agreed to. It was Flint Dibble who published an article in The Conversation saying with Netflix Ancient Apocalypse, Graham Hancock has declared war on archaeologists. And in a letter from Flint challenging Hancock to a debate, he cited the fact that Hancock on Joe Rogan had said that he would be willing to debate archaeologists, and Graham Hancock has responded. I don't know how this is going to go. It is something to look forward to, I hope. But Graham Hancock will be debating Flint Dibble on the Joe Rogan Experience in October of 2023. However, in his letter to Flint accepting his challenge, Hancock wrote, I had hoped that Professor John Hoops of the University of Kansas, who has been the most vehement and insulting of all archaeologists in his attacks on me over many years, would participate. But he's disappointed that I'm not going to be doing that. He claims that I'm hiding behind my keyboard and concludes that Hoops is overdue for a comeuppance. Well, the issue of a white culture bringer in Central and South America is not new. We have representations of Quetzalcoatl, who has survived in folklore as being a white bringer of culture, although we now know that, in fact, those myths and stories, which had a basis in earlier Aztec legends, were modified by the Spanish to make it seem as if they were the ones who had been prophesied to arrive, and that they were the ones who added information about his white skin and red hair and other characteristics. The issue of racism is real, and the alignment of pseudoarchaeology with racism is something that is relatively well documented. It includes individuals like Frank Collin, also known as Frank Joseph, the name under which he publishes his books, who you may remember as having been the principal character in the Supreme Court case, the village of Skokie versus the National Socialist Party of America, the Nazi Party of America in 1978, which wanted to lead a parade of neo-Nazis through Skokie, a community of Holocaust survivors. This story is one that was featured in the movie The Blues Brothers by John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. Unfortunately, these Illinois Nazis are still with us today. Frank Joseph's books include books about Atlantis and 2012, The Lost Civilization of Lemuria, The Ark of the Covenant, Unearthing Ancient America, and he was also a founding editor of Ancient American Magazine, which publishes articles about people who arrived in the New World from elsewhere. As you'll see, it also includes some Mormon themes, and in fact, one of the co-editors with Frank Joseph was a writer and a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who uses the magazine to identify people other than indigenous people who came to the Americas long ago. This includes white people. This includes also lost tribes of Israel. And it asks the question, who were these ancient mound builders? A more recent book by Marco Vigato, who's featured in the Netflix series, is The Empires of Atlantis, in which a suggestion is made about the evolution of Atlanteans from hybridization with aliens to create a more intelligent race that created this advanced civilization. Well, this has an impact in popular culture. And Jason Chansley, who was the infamous QAnon shaman, is actually someone who posted about Graham Hancock. He himself was a Graham Hancock fan who created YouTube videos prior to the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. So issues of pseudoarchaeology play out in real contemporary political circumstances. This notion of a species with amnesia, which is used by Graham Hancock, is something that echoes the language of Immanuel Velikovsky and is repeated by individuals like Robert Seppeher, who represents, I think, the far right wing of some of this pseudoarchaeology that's being undertaken. Well, archaeologists, as we know, don't like Nazis. I suggest that one of the things that may be at work here is something called cryptomnesia. I'm not saying that Graham Hancock is a racist, and I'm not saying that he's a white supremacist, but there are elements of the stories that he tells that may come from a long legacy of literature that actually had racism and white supremacy as a theme of it, but manifests itself in terms of a long history of pseudoarchaeology and speculative nonfiction that has its roots in occultism and esotericism. Cryptomnesia is what happens when a forgotten memory returns without it being recognized as such by a subject who believes it's something new and original. It's a memory bias whereby a person may falsely recall generating a thought, idea, a song, or a joke, not deliberately engaging in plagiarism, but rather experiencing a memory of it as if it were a new inspiration. Well, you can intuit how this intersects with the notion of intuition and revelation and realization and all of these other esoteric practices or esoteric values, especially when we have a long history of racism and white supremacy in the literature of the Victorian era. This includes Edward King, Viscount Kingsborough, who believed that the ancient Mexicans were the lost tribes of Israel and published 9 volumes devoted to proving this. Godfrey Higgins, who published in 1836 a book in which he traces all world religions to a common source in an attempt to draw aside the veil of the Saitic Isis, or an inquiry into the origins of languages, natures, and religions. But one of the things that Graham Hancock does is promote this notion of a unitary origin for knowledge, that it can all be traced back to a single source, this advanced civilization of the Ice Age that was the source of all knowledge for the founding of civilizations around the world, which of course robs all of those different cultures of their own ability. Well, in 1763, excavations at Pompeii revealed a world that had been destroyed. Pompeii and Herculaneum were 2 cities destroyed in 79 AD by the eruption of Vesuvius. And it was visual representations of this destruction that inspired the fiction work of Edward Bulwer Lytton. And the last days of Pompeii, this notion of a divine retribution carried out on Pompeii in a cataclysmic destruction, represents a thread that ultimately is revived in the context of stories like that of ancient apocalypse. Some other things happening in the early 19th century include work by Jean Frederick Waldeck, an illustrator who depicts Maya monuments in a way that makes them look as if they had come from the Mediterranean. You see here above is his drawing, below is a photograph of the same monument, and it's this embellishment that fires the European imagination to think of things that aren't really there. This is also contributed to by Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg, a French priest, who publishes Monuments Anciens de Mexique in 1866, comparing the Old World to the New World, or the Europe and Africa and Asia to the things that were happening in the Americas, claiming that these correspondences indicated a common origin on the lost continent of Atlantis. At the same time, we see the emergence of pyramidology, which interestingly has a consonance with something called British Israelism, an idea that begins in the 16th century with the publication about the 10 lost tribes, which identifies the people of the British Isles as the real Israelites. In fact, one of the problems with British Israelism is the idea that it sees in the populations of Great Britain the real Israelites, whereas the people who claim to be the Jews of the Old Testament are imposters who came from India or someplace else. Charles Piazzi Smith was one of the first people to write about the Great Pyramid. Actually, John Taylor is writing about it back in 1859. Charles Smith builds on that and writes a book called Our Inheritance of the Great Pyramid in 1864, followed by a sequel in which he fuses pyramidology with British Israelism. The idea being that it was the Israelites who built the Great Pyramid, and in it was encoded secret knowledge that can then benefit the populations of their descendants, including these British Israelites. And these two things are very much interwoven, and British Israelism ultimately contributes to what's known as Christian identity movement in the United States. Another important author of the early 19th century is Josiah Priest, who wrote American Antiquities and Discoveries in the West, which attributed most of the ruins that were found across North America to people other than the Native Americans. And in fact, his books are still being peddled by Ancient American Magazine. We also have work being done in the early 20th century by Squire and Davis, who mapped the mounds of the eastern United States, and in so doing, talk about a race of mound builders who had been the original architects of these many places. Well, Ignatius Donnelly comes on the scene with his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He's inspired by the work of William Whiston and also by Plato. He also invokes the work of Sir Thomas More, who wrote about Utopia as this idyllic island, and Francis Bacon, who describes the new Atlantis as a utopian society. And in his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882, he essentially paints the lost continent of Atlantis in the Atlantic as a source for all world civilizations. Well, interestingly, what's happening in 1882 is also the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1882, and Congressman Ignatius Donnelly is addressing issues of immigration through writing Atlantis. In fact, he's giving preference to the populations that had come from the North Atlantic and from Europe over those who had come from the West, especially from China. So it's very important to read Atlantis in the context of the politics of the time. It's also Donnelly who publishes Ragnarok, in which he revives the idea of William Whiston that in fact comets had destroyed Atlantis and caused the Great Flood, both of which are characteristics of ancient apocalypse and revived in the work of Graham Hancock. And we also have the work of Augustus Le Plongeon, who in 1886 is attributing the Mayas to a civilization that had existed 11,500 years ago. I think Graham Hancock is very much writing in the spirit of Augustus Le Plongeon. His wife was a spiritualist. Alice Dixon Le Plongeon was a member of the Theosophical Society and writes about the use of gnosis and past life regression in order to be able to understand the ancient Mayas. Other work is being done by Désiré Charnay, who actually traces the Toltecs back to the Old World, suggesting they may have come from the Himalayas. And here you see an illustration from his 1885 book that portrays a Toltec king in exactly the same pose as this ancient statue of Zeus. Well, Helena Blavatsky is another important contributor to this thread of occultism. Isis Unveiled, published in 1877, seeks to create this synthesis of science and religion. In 1875, together with Henry Steele Olcott, she forms the Theosophical Society, and in 1888 publishes The Secret Doctrine, a real synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy, and she is often identified as sort of the mother of the New Age. Other important theosophists included Annie Besant, Charles Webster Leadbeater, Catherine Tingley, Rudolf Steiner, Alice Bailey. These names may be familiar to you, but all of them are very significant contributors to this thread of what ultimately becomes what I'm referring to as scientific occultism. We also find contributions that are coming from Zelia Nuttall, Gertrude Barrows Bennett. The authors are not just men, they're women, and in fact, women were allowed to speak publicly on spiritualism at a time when they couldn't speak publicly on anything else. These works of the early 20th century include works of William Perry, who suggested that all human civilization had originated in Egypt and had spread from there to the East and also to the Americas. And his book, The Children of the Sun, cites a unitary origin for civilization, tracing all of it back to Egypt. And he was once asked what was happening in the rest of the world while Egypt was developing its technology and knowledge, and he says nothing. Percy Fawcett, in the early 1920s, goes off in search of a lost white race in Amazonia, a combination of eugenics and a quest for the lost civilization is firing up the imaginations. But Fawcett himself is an occultist, a theosophist. Also happening in the 1920s, we have Manny Palmer Hall publishing The Secret Teachings of All Ages, which is now available in a new deluxe edition, in which he's seeking to describe Masonic and Kabbalistic and Rosicrucian elements, a very influential work in contemporary occultism. And of course, Mircea Eliade, who explores the issue of shamanism. Now, Eliade, unfortunately, has connections with the Romanian Iron Guard. He is very anti-Semitic in his youth, and this remains a thread in his work throughout his entire career. Anyone who cites Mircea Eliade needs to be aware of this and consider it. Other important writers of this time includes Hans Herbiger and Philip Fauth, whose notion of world ice doctrine is echoed in some of the work of Ancient Apocalypse, especially references to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. They ultimately have an effect on Velikovsky and others who are citing new types of astronomical events. And of course, this contributes to threads of occultism in the Third Reich, which is influenced directly by the work of Madison Grant, an American eugenicist who writes a book called The Passing of the Great Race, which is translated into German and comes back to us as The Master Race, with organizations that are supporting these notions of Ariosophy, the knowledge of the Aryans. And Lewis Spence actually cites the occult causes of the present war. Well, occultists are also doing archaeology in the Americas. And this becomes a very important thread in early American archaeology, including Arthur Poznansky's work at Tiwanaku, Edmund Kiss and Hans Schindler Bellamy, who are both former Nazis, who trace the origins of Tiwanaku civilization back 10,000 years. And of course, it was founded by superior white people with an advanced knowledge and technology. Well, cognitive dissonance is what happens when you're presented with evidence that directly contradicts what it is that you believe. And unfortunately, Leon Festiger, who investigated this, points out that it results in a doubling down. And this doubling down is something that occurs with Immanuel Velikovsky and his work on worlds in collision, an alternative interpretation of the cosmos. In the 1960s, Frank Waters talks about apocalypse and Hopi prophecies for the end of the world. And we know that all of this is infused with the development of the internet. In fact, some of the earliest work that's happening in computer science in the 1960s is also infused with this lore, including occult lore and other notions about New Age thought and imaginative, speculative nonfiction. Of course, Eric von Däniken comes on the scene. And his work, of course, persists to the present day, and he becomes a very important influence in the context of Graham Hancock's work, as does Peter Tompkins, who writes The Secrets of the Great Pyramid and Mysteries of the Mexican Pyramid. While an important figure in the thread of Graham Hancock's thought is Colin Wilson, who comes on the scene in 1956, writing about outsider literature, and writes a book called The Occult. And the cultic milieu in which Graham Hancock operates is one that circles around Colin Wilson for a while and his work. Wilson writes about Atlantis and the Neanderthals, 100,000 years of lost history. I don't have time to read you the cover blurb, but it's quite the flight. And I would recommend that you have a look at exactly the kinds of things that Wilson is weaving together. At the same time, Alan Landsberg is producing the In Search Of series, which is hosted by Rod Serling and then by Leonard Nimoy, in which we find reference to the coming Maya end of the world. That December 24th, Christmas Eve, 2011 AD, on that day they may return to seek the fate of the colony left on Earth by the aliens. Jacob Bernowski in the 1970s presents a series, a British documentary series called The Ascent of Man, that many of you may remember, which tells the story of human evolution and the emergence of human civilization. And I would characterize Graham Hancock as being very much like a New Age Jacob Bernowski, with Ancient Apocalypse attempting to tell a new story of civilization. Other authors contributing to this include Frank Waters in the 1970s, and the 1970s becomes a time of a great deal of speculation, including information about ancient esoteric traditions, and they become combined with psychedelia. Authors like Barry Fell and Jeffrey Goodman invoke ancient settlers to the New World and psychic archaeology, and the 1970s are replete with this type of stuff. Zecharia Sitchin in 1976 publishes The 12th Planet, which also suggests that there was a planet called Nibiru that circled through the solar system, changing world history. And then, of course, we find Robert Anton Wilson, RAW, who brings all of this together in talking about the secret Illuminati information and becomes a very important figure in these threads of scientific occultism. Of course, all of this is a conspiracy. The Aquarian conspiracy, the New Age conspiracy. Marilyn Ferguson does not use either the words occult or the New Age in her 1980 book, which may have something to do with the fact that both Ron and Nancy Reagan were very much into the occult and the New Age, but moral majority didn't want to hear that. Well, Graham Hancock comes on the scene as an important writer at this time. I'll give you a little bit of background on Graham Hancock's biography. He was born in Edinburgh in 1950 to an English father and Scottish mother. His paternal grandparents had been missionaries in Iran. His father was a Presbyterian medical missionary to India, where he spent his early years. He was the only child of 4, the only survivor. He had a baby brother who died when he was 8, and this becomes an important part of Hancock's worldview, is these terrible things that have happened to his family in the past. His mother describes him as a child who was bright and confident, full of curiosity, and very good about arguing about almost anything. He graduates from Durham University in 1973 with first-class honors in sociology and marries his first wife, who is Somali. He goes to Somalia as a foreign correspondent in 1975. They have 2 children. He co-edits The Internationalist from 1976 to 1979 and reports on the 1977 Somalia-Ethiopian War as an East Africa correspondent for The Economist between 1981 and 1983. His second wife is a British photographer. His marriage ends in 1991, and he has a business with a woman, a photographer, Santa Faya, who becomes his third wife. She's also a photographer, and the two of them have a business publishing coffee table books of photography in order to promote the cultural heritage of Somalia and Ethiopia. Well, Hancock says in an interview later for the Daily Mail that there were cataclysmic events in my early life. Maybe there is a connection between my attraction to cataclysmic theory and my own subconscious. Well, Hancock is working directly with 2 of the most brutal dictators that have existed in recent history, Mohammed Siad Barre in Somalia and Mengistu Haile Mariam in Ethiopia, where Hancock is able to travel through these countries because he's in the good graces of these authoritarian dictators, while horrible things are happening, genocide and other political violence. He's writing articles for the Washington Post about how these dictators are improving society, even in the midst of violence. And it becomes clear that he is working in the good graces of these dictators because he's feeding positive stories about them to the Western press, which is very difficult situation to be in for a journalist, but it's actually his ability to produce these articles that gives him the ability to write this and to write the text for what becomes an important coffee table book. But he writes, "I was under no illusions. They would not have footed the bills or permitted me to visit historic sites forbidden to others if they did not think that what I was doing would be helpful to them." Well, it's in the context of this work for dictators in the African Horn that Graham Hancock writes a book called Lords of Poverty, which is a book that comes out in 1989, and it's a little bit contradictory. It's clear that Hancock at the time is feeling a great deal of conflict, probably personal conflict as well as ethical conflict. In 1988, he writes an article for the Sunday Times in which he claims that massive international aid is needed if anything is to be achieved quickly. The Somali government's emergency appeal, launched on Wednesday, asked for food for 9 months to meet the basic needs of 600,000 destitute civilians. Well, he writes a book against aid programs in which he says that aid programs are so corrupt that they're utterly beyond reform and should be abolished. Well, these two quotes indicate that in 1988, Graham Hancock is having some pretty significant conflicts, internal conflicts and others. His first wife was Somali, and that helps him to travel in Somalia. But among the things that I think are very important to keep in mind are that Hancock is being a compromised journalist. He talks about the people he was working with as terrible men who'd kill you for anything. He says, "I never really thought about that. I think it was and he says, "I think I was a profoundly amoral individual." And in another interview, or actually in the same interview for The Observer, he says, "I think it's terribly important that your actions harmonize with your words. When I look back on my life, I see a lot of hypocrisy." Well, it's out of this horrible cauldron of Somalia and Ethiopia in the 1970s and 1980s that Hancock begins, and I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit, his work on his first book of pseudoarchaeology, The Sign and the Seal. In 1983, he sees the film Raiders of the Lost Ark and realizes that stories of the Lost Ark in Ethiopia would make a really good story. The cover blurb of the book says the subject of this book could constitute the single most shattering secret of the last 3,000 years. And he writes a book called The Sign and the Seal, The Quest for the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which tells the story of his personal quest to find the Lost Ark of the Covenant, which is hidden in a Christian church in Ethiopia in one of the most dangerous parts of the country. And I have to emphasize, he would not have been able to do this field work without the protection of the Ethiopian dictator Mengistu. But he tells a wonderful story and weaves together all kinds of things in it. The story itself, however, brings together lots of different elements to it. I'm not going to read this here, but I've highlighted a couple of parts of it. But he writes that I was under no illusions about how the project was viewed by senior figures in the regime. They would not have footed the bills or permitted me to visit historic sites forbidden to others if they did not think that what I was doing would be helpful to them. So ultimately, The Sign and the Seal sells very well. In the Los Angeles Times, however, it's identified as being entertaining precisely because it's so trippy. But Hancock ladles so much weirdness and wackiness in his bubbling cauldron of a book, so much speculation and surmise that the reader's mind begins to boggle. Still, Hancock urges us on. Pursuing the Ark through Ethiopia, he writes, was something like pursuing a ghost through a maze, and the author thereby neatly sums up the reader's experience of his own book. Well, in the 1990s, work is being done on Great Pyramid, and there's a very interesting documentary that airs on the BBC called The Great Pyramid Gateway to the Stars. And in the early 90s, a cultic milieu emerges, which includes Colin Wilson writing about From Atlantis to the Sphinx, recovering the lost wisdom of the ancient world. And Hancock comes into Colin Wilson's circle, along with the authors Rand and Rose Flimath. Rand Flimath was a collaborator with Colin Wilson in writing a book called The Atlantis Blueprint. Essentially, they claim that Atlantis is located on the continent of Antarctica, where it's covered by miles of ice. And if only we had the technology, we'd be able to find the traces of it. Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert write a book called The Orion Mystery: Unlocking the Secrets of the Pyramids. And Hancock, Bauval, and John Anthony West become part of a group that is reevaluating the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid and pushing the story that, in fact, these monuments are much older than archaeologists claim that they are, and that they align with the stars to reveal forgotten wisdom about the observations of the heavens by ancient Egyptians. In so doing, they're inspired by the work of René Schwaller de Lubeck, who was an Egyptologist, but also an esotericist, who thought that the ancient Egyptians had the key to knowledge and gnosis in a different way from other ancient peoples. And this idea that the Egyptians had this key to gnosis becomes a characteristic of the work of all of these various writers in the 1990s. A biography of Schwaller de Lubeck published in 1990 becomes a critical part of this cultic milieu. In 1993, The Mystery of the Sphinx airs on NBC, hosted by Charlton Heston, and it's followed up 3 years later by The Mysterious Origins of Man, also hosted by Charlton Heston, both of which are mainstream NBC special television specials featuring the work that's coming out of this cultic milieu of the early 1990s. This has a response from archaeologists, the creation of the Hall of Mott website, and the publication of a book called Archaeological Fantasies, representing the pushback that's coming from archaeologists against this mainstream pseudoarchaeology. It's also at this time that we have Adrian Gilbert and Maurice Cotterill writing the Mayan Prophecies, the book that really helps kick off a lot of these ideas about December 21st or 22nd, 2012, and the idea of the Maya apocalypse, the coming end of the world as predicted by the ancient Mayas on the basis of their precise calendar. This is something that Graham Hancock promotes in Fingerprints of the Gods, in which he devotes several sections to the Maya prophecies of the end of the world and suggests that the gnosis, or the knowledge, the traditions that are coming from these ancient lost civilization, or this ancient lost civilization, is a warning about the end of the world. That this is one of the key parts of this story. And this is the ancient apocalypse that's being talked about, is that there was an experience of an ancient apocalypse that allowed these ancient people to see the cycles of comets or other destruction that would bring about the end of our own world. Hancock, of course, sees people's response and rejection of his ideas as a form of intellectual persecution. He sees that he's being rejected by archaeologists, and makes a very interesting statement in this interview for The Independent in 1995, in which he says, "We've moved away from the logical, the scientific. We are looking for explanations that satisfy us emotionally." Hancock is a myth maker. He's intentionally writing myths about the ancient past that are emotionally, psychically satisfying. That appeal to the intuition, that appeal to conspiracy theorists, and also appeal to people who are the seekers, who are seeking this ancient knowledge. And he satisfies them by providing stories about it, but not very much in the way of evidence. One of his strategies is by not saying that the ancient civilization he's talking about is Atlantis. In fact, he almost consciously excludes Atlantis from his discussions of the lost civilization, in part because he knows that if he does that, he's going to be dismissed relatively quickly. Well, something important happens in 1995 that helps Hancock go viral. His book, Fingerprints of the Gods, is published in 1995, which is the same year that we learn how to use Internet Explorer and Netscape Navigator. In fact, I think that the advent of the World Wide Web, as well as ideas about Y2K and the possible collapse of computer networks due to this software glitch, and the notions that that might also be accompanied by a millennialist notion of the end of the world at the end of the millennium, 1995 to 2000 was a really weird time period. Another thing that helps Graham Hancock to go viral is the fact that his book sells very well in a Japanese translation. Over 1 million copies of Fingerprints of the Gods are published in Japan and purchased by an avid public that's interested in knowing about this ancient world. Something else that propels Graham Hancock into virality are his interviews with Art Bell and George Newry on AM Coast to Coast. Listeners are able to pull information about his books and about his theories from these radio hosts, talk show hosts, who are sponsoring stories on conspiracy theory, on the paranormal, on UFOs, and of course on the work of Graham Hancock. Other authors who come into this mix include Andrew Collins, who is contributing a number of books in this pseudoarchaeology vein. And Graham Hancock is also pulling from books like Hamlet's Mill in order to interpret the movement of the heavens as something that was recognized by ancient peoples. In so doing, he pulls upon a book that was panned almost immediately after its publication. If you look at reviews of Hamlet's Mill, it had no traction whatsoever in the academic community. It was a piece of stigmatized knowledge, rejected knowledge. But Graham Hancock revives that in the context of his own work. He's identified as the New Age answer to David Attenborough in the production of a 3-part series called The Quest for the Lost Civilization. And Hancock says there's serious problems in Egyptology, even if we are all completely wrong. By we, Hancock means he and his fellow parascientists in the collection of popular writers who have closed the gap between well-researched science and plausible science fiction. A very good description of where his books go. Keeper of Genesis discusses the redating of the Sphinx, as well as interpretations of its association with archaeoastronomy. And then kind of a weird book that Graham Hancock publishes in 1998, which is a really interesting glitch in his history. Many people say that Graham Hancock does not talk about ancient aliens, but that's not true. In 1998, inspired by a book called The Monuments of Mars by Richard Hoagland, Graham Hancock reinterprets the notorious face on Mars, something that Carl Sagan writes about, in his book The Mars Mystery, whose cover bears the Eye of Providence from the Masonic symbolism, and suggests that in fact there was an ancient civilization on Mars that had been destroyed by a cosmic catastrophe, and that the survivors of that catastrophe on Mars had come to Earth, where they were the founders of an advanced ancient civilization. So this was an apocalypse that preceded the ancient apocalypse on Earth. There was an ancient apocalypse on Mars. So we're talking about 3 apocalypses now. The Mars apocalypse, the ancient apocalypse, the Maya apocalypse that didn't really happen, and a future apocalypse in terms of the future destruction of the world. Well, along the way, we get John Major Jenkins writing about the Maya apocalypse with a series of books that come out starting in 1994 and run up through more recent. And then with the beginning of the new millennium, we have Atlantis, the Lost Empire being released by Disney, followed by Graham Hancock the following year, writing about a book called Underworld, in which he identifies geological formations off the island of Yonaguni, Japan, as traces of an undersea civilization. These now have been carefully studied by geologists who identify them as natural features, but Graham Hancock suggests that in fact they may be traces of an ancient civilization. In 2004, he publishes a book called Talisman, the subtitle of which says Gnostics, Freemasons, Revolutionaries, and the 2,000-year-old conspiracy at work in the world today, asking the question in the appendix, could Al-Qaeda be seeing America as a Masonic crusading power whose occupying force in the Middle East is Israel? And was 9/11 an expression of this belief? Does 9/11 have a direct link to Al-Qaeda's declaration to liberate the Dome of the Rock? And more sinisterly, was 9/11 an attack on the Temple of Solomon? In fact, this book is right in the heart of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, identifying a Masonic Jewish conspiracy at the heart of the 9/11 attacks, and suggesting that this is seeking to control the world. The book was first published in 2004. It was released again in a new version in 2011. And then some interesting things happen in the early 2000s. This includes Daniel Pinchbeck's publication of a book called Breaking Open the Head, in which he chronicles his experiences with psychedelics, something that he does on the same journey to the Amazon that's taken by author Paul Theroux, who actually makes Pinchbeck a character in his novel Blinding Light, about how taking psychedelics actually can result in inner visions, but physical blindness. It's kind of an interesting conceit for the novel, which I recommend. And then in 2003, we have the Burning Man Festival, which I'm familiar with because I was there. And at the 2003 Burning Man Festival, Daniel Pinchbeck presents his model for the interpretation of the Maya apocalypse and its synthesis with psychedelia. These two things come together in the context of the Burning Man Festival. And the following year, in 2004, Daniel Pinchbeck introduces Graham Hancock to ayahuasca, which becomes a very important of Graham Hancock's continued writing, including his book, Supernatural, published in 2005, in which, taking some clues from The Mind in the Cave, published in 2002 by David Lewis Williams, Graham Hancock suggests that the ancient artists of the Upper Paleolithic who were painting cave paintings in France and Spain were actually inspired by psychedelics, which allowed them to come in contact with ancient masters. I'm going to try to get through some of these final things so I can get to some of the questions. I just had a look at the comments, but let me just make a few more points and then I'll take some questions. But I hope that all of you can see what it is that I'm trying to develop here, which is the idea that Graham Hancock works within the context of a very complex cultic milieu of authors, writers, and the addition of psychedelics to that just makes it even more weird. In 2006, Daniel Pinchbeck publishes a book in which he talks about crop circles, alien abductions, the Maya calendar in 2012, and also Graham Hancock's theories. 2012 itself is a publishing phenomenon with dozens of books, actually hundreds or thousands of books written referencing the Maya apocalypse. It's probably the best known apocalypse that we know in our lifetimes that never happened. Came and it went. We didn't have an apocalypse or a transformation of consciousness, no asteroids, no sunspots, no Yellowstone supervolcano, nothing. It was all a lot of hype. It was based on a misinterpretation of the ancient Mayas. Well, this contributes to the notion of cycle of cosmic catastrophes. In 2006, the first book to articulate the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is published by Intervision's Barron Company, in which the idea of cycles of cosmic catastrophes, a physical issue, a physical phenomenon, is contributing to these cosmic cycles. Well, Graham Hancock talks a lot about psychedelics, including in a TED Talk in 2013, which contributes to our understanding of the broader context of his books, Fingerprints of the Gods, Magicians of the Gods, and America Before. I'm going to finish up here by mentioning just a few things which are good practices or rules of thumb in dealing with pseudoscience. It's important to embrace skepticism. It's important to avoid fallacies. It's important to explain our scientific methods and to encourage amateurs. We don't discourage them from participating. Deal very gently with issues of religion, whether it's scientific creationism or scientific occultism. Always keep an open mind and use humor and emotions. This slide from my colleague Jason Colavito recommends the importance of acknowledging personal bias, cultivating respect, taking pseudoarchaeologists seriously, which is something they often don't want, reviewing the new literature quickly, knowing fringe history, and paying attention to popular interests. He also encourages archaeologists to lower the cost of our books and unlock academic archaeology so the public can access our science, as well as writing for an engaged public. And I think that one of the best books written about what it is that we do was by the late E.O. Wilson, who talks about the importance of a consilience of knowledge from multiple scientific fields. Well, the current manifestations of ancient apocalypse are in the future. In June, there is going to be a cosmic summit in Asheville, North Carolina, in which Graham Hancock and others are featured talking about the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which I'm not going to get into, although I'm happy to answer some questions. But I want to finish with one slide. This is my last slide. On the cover of Fingerprints of the Gods, Graham Hancock asks the question, could the story of mankind be far older than we have previously believed? Well, there's some advice that Graham Hancock publishes on his website that comes from his own father. In a letter written on the 1st of November in 1999, Donald Hancock, Graham's father, writes these words. There is one kind of question you should try to avoid. This is the leading question, which is worded in such a way that the answer hoped for will be reached in trying to deal with it. This is the sort of question which any decent scientist will do his utmost to avoid, as it leads to flawed work and a biased answer. With this type of leading question, The answer you want, as often as not, determines the answer you get, even though this answer is not true. So it is really best to avoid this type of question. And I think all of us can recognize what those leading questions are. I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit over. I got kind of carried away here with a lot of information. Please go back and look at the video. I made this presentation with the idea that the video on YouTube is something that people could go back to and look at the various sources that I've cited. And I hope that you'll use that as a resource for understanding the context, the cultural context, the scientific occultism, and the cultic milieu within which ancient apocalypse exists. Thank you. Eugenia, your microphone is muted.
I apologize. I've come down with a little bit of a cold, and I figured you and our audience did not want to listen to me hacking and blowing my nose, and so
well, I'm very sorry.
Properly put myself on.
I had a lot of content that I wanted to get through, but thank you very much for your patience and the patience of everyone else for this.
Well, I was what I was saying when I was muted, so it didn't make any difference, is that indeed it's going to be very useful for both the people who watched the program tonight as well as those looking at it in the future. It'll be nice to be able to stop and get some of those books and the context and some of the materials that you presented. That it was really quite an overwhelming lot of material. I noticed you mentioned that Graham Hancock is a New Age Jacob Bronowski, and then a little bit later on, someone identified him as a New Age David Attenborough. Somehow or another, those two people don't seem to have a great deal in common. But I suspect that Hancock himself would really rather not be a version of somebody else at all. Those weren't terribly I mean, in one way, they're very complementary because both Bronowski and Attenborough are far more competent than Hancock when it comes to any sort of scholarship. But I digress. You really brought back a lot of old memories, including nightmares like Mysterious Origins of Man. Oh my, I haven't thought about that in many. Mom is what we call it at NCSE. You know, as you were talking and you know, placing this particular pseudoarchaeology that of Graham Hancock and the Netflix series into this very rich historical and cultural context of so many different strains, from late 1800s theosophy even, and other themes that go really quite deep, including, of course, unfortunately, the anti-Semitism and white supremacy that somehow gets tacked onto it as well. What is it specifically, do you think, about archaeology that makes it such a popular pseudoscience? I'm thinking that, you know, it certainly is drawing from all these old traditions, which is not quite what I was thinking about. But why is it that people today find pseudoarchaeology such a hook? What is so fascinating about it that people are so eager to believe? Is it like just any other pseudoscience, or is there something special about it?
No, there's something very fundamental to archaeology that you, Jeannie, will appreciate from your background in physical anthropology. And it also has to do with the way that people approach issues of creationism. Archaeology is telling origin stories. Every culture in the world has origin stories. Mm-hmm. And archaeology is the scientific origin story. And there are people who don't like a scientific origin story. It doesn't resonate necessarily with them. It also becomes quite complicated to understand if you don't have an adequate academic background. People fear complexity. They want simplicity. I teach a course on rise of civilization, in which we look at the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and from village life to city life. But I point out that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture happens in the book of Genesis in one generation. It's the story of Cain and Abel. Bang, you get a herder and a farmer. There's no discussion at all of how that occurs. The idea of the dispersion of languages is the story of Tower of Babel. It's a very short story. people want things short. They want things easy to understand. They want a story that can be encapsulated, a very quick and easy story. That's not how archaeology is. Archaeology can be very complicated. And what Hancock is presenting is a quick and easy story, that there was only one origin of civilization, that it happened in this particular way over 10,000 years ago as a result of the destruction of civilizations by comets. So you have one origin, you have one destruction, and you have this only tradition that continues after it, although with a variety of variations. But he says all pyramids come from the same source. The reason why people around the world build pyramids is because they were inspired by this same ancient civilization. That's a gross oversimplification of reality.
One might say. All right. What do we have in the way of questions from our friends who are watching this program on YouTube? Should archaeologists be giving them credibility by agreeing to a debate?
I don't think so.
I'm with you. Please continue.
And actually, when Graham Hancock invited me to a debate, he didn't really invite me to a debate. I do podcasts and documentaries all the time. I never got an email message. No producer ever contacted me. Joe Rogan issued this invitation in an interview on the Joe Rogan Experience. Right. He later mentions it on Twitter. And I responded to his tweet immediately. And I said, I can't use science to argue against metaphysics. And I'm not going to use a different metaphysics to argue against your metaphysics. What I've tried to present this evening is the idea that this scientific occultism, and of course it's in quotation marks, scientific occultism, is at heart a spiritual/religious belief. It may claim to be science, but it's not. And I don't think that a scientist, well, you've had this experience, Jeannie. I don't think that a scientist can debate someone who's coming from a position of faith. And that includes from a position of gnosis, from a position of this erasure of the difference between faith and science. They have attached themselves to a reality. It's almost like a kind of presuppositionalism, in which the only thing that's not in question is the reality of the core belief. Everything else can be questioned, but the reality of the core belief does not change.
Yeah, and that makes it hard to deal with in a scholarly sense, certainly. Can we have a next question? Jay Diamond wants to know, skeptic and former presenter to Bay Area Skeptics, Mick West, has gone on Joe Rogan to discuss UFOs, and some other things. Outside of the issue of debate, do you think it's worth going on to enlighten his massive audience?
Absolutely. I absolutely do. I think a debate is pointless, but I really think that Joe, if you're listening tonight, if you look at this, or if you look at it on YouTube, invite archaeologists to come on your program. Graham Hancock is not representative of archaeology. It's pseudoarchaeology. You get geologists, you get Neil deGrasse Tyson, you get other scientists to come on your show. Why is the only person who ever talks about archaeology on your show Graham Hancock? There are hundreds of archaeologists who you could be speaking to. Invite archaeologists on the Joe Rogan Experience, not to debate, but to be by themselves and talk about what they do by themselves.
I mean, the science itself is sufficiently fascinating. It doesn't have to be in the context of refuting some goofball ideas. Radiation Bill wants to know, where does Afrocentrism fit in all this? Would you consider the prominent contributors to this movement, such as Martin Bernal, are similarly misguided, or is this a robust and vigorous field of study?
Well, I think that Afrocentrism does fall under the category of pseudoarchaeology, but I don't think that it has this occult/esoteric component. I don't see Afrocentrism as having a metaphysical quality to it. It's more of a pseudo-history or of a pseudoscience or of a pseudo-archaeology. But I don't see this insistence on a Gnostic reality. I don't see this insistence on a metaphysical belief system, which is what I'm referring to as scientific occultism. I don't see that in the Afro. Now, it probably does exist in some parts of Afrocentrism. It really depends on what you're looking at. Certainly, the Nation of Islam had metaphysical aspects to it. So there probably are parts of it that have this metaphysical quality. But I don't see it as part of the same cultic milieu. And in fact, I think that the white supremacist part of it, the racist part of it, may contribute to excluding those voices from Black authors and Black participants. It's a very interesting phenomenon.
It is. I haven't. You really are bringing back a lot of. You're bringing back the '90s, really, in so many ways. I really like that. That's certainly given me something to think about. I think you're right about that. I don't believe that Afrocentrism has that kind of occult, but I think ideological, yes, but that's not the same thing as what you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about something that really comes out of the biggest component of it is the Western esoteric tradition. But as you know, Helena Blavatsky also included Eastern traditions in there, and Henry Steele Olcott was a big promoter of Buddhism. In fact, the two of them were the first Westerners to formally convert to Buddhism. So the reason I say eclectic esotericism is because it includes both the Western esoteric tradition and also Eastern traditions. It's really a mix of a lot of different kinds of things.
Indeed. Okay, Bay Area Skeptics wants to know, you cited a number of references to Atlantis and or Egypt as the source of ultimate knowledge, but also racist/eugenics implications. Is the implication that those civilizations were Caucasian?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what's being presented. It's very rare that you see any depictions of Atlantis as being either multiracial or Black or Asian or any group other than white and Caucasian. That probably has to do with the fact that it's a story that originates with Plato. But he could be talking about North Africa. Atlantis could have been in an African location and could have had a Black population in some people's imagination. But that's not the model that's presented most often. And in fact, there is a racialist element to Ignatius Donnelly's 1882 description of Atlantis as being in the North Atlantic. And he has chapters in there on Irish colonies from Atlantis and Aryan colonies from Atlantis. The association of Aryans with Atlantis is also something that's emphasized by Blavatsky, who talks about her root races, including the Lemurians, the Atlanteans, the Aryans. But this idea, Heinrich Himmler, who was the founder of the Ahnenerbe, also was very interested in Atlantis. Now, an interesting question comes up. Did Hitler believe in Atlantis? From what I've read, he did not. He actually thought that Himmler was kind of foolish in all of this. But it was something that Himmler was actually quite interested in. And of course, Himmler's the founder of the SS. So these things have a very important place within the Third Reich.
Now, it's funny, the question also mentioned Egypt, and the previous question was about Afrocentrism. And part of the Afrocentrism series of notions is that Cleopatra was Black. Whereas actually, oddly enough, Cleopatra could, because we do have her whole genealogy, really going back several generations, she was Greek. She was probably the only white person in all of Egypt. But Egyptians are not white, you know.
These categories of white and Black into the ancient past. I think
it's very difficult to do that. I totally take your notification. Yeah. But whatever people were living in Egypt, they were probably a bit different from the Greeks, but nonetheless, there's a lot of, you know, we actually did have a speaker talking about race a while ago, a few months ago, although we didn't talk specifically about, modern human variation, which, is a more appropriate way of referring to it. But certainly it is the case that human populations have changed and swapped around genes for millions of years. Can you speak more about early computer science and occultism?
I would really strongly recommend John Markoff's book called What the Dormouse Said, which really tells the story of the origin of what became Silicon Valley. But it should be a surprise to none of you in the Bay Area skeptics that the Bay Area was a hotbed of occultism and esoteric beliefs, but it also was, because of Berkeley, the center of some of the very first and pioneering computer science that was taking place. And some very interesting facts. Do you know that the very first piece of e-commerce that has ever been recorded in history was a marijuana sale? And that we know from the names that were used for various things that the early computer scientists were reading Lord of the Rings. They were staying up very late at night because of timeshare on the computers. You couldn't get in during the middle of the day. That was when the alpha people were on it. You had to wait to get on your computer at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. And while you were waiting to get on, what were you doing? You were reading science fiction. You were reading fantasy. You were reading about astrology. You were considering psychic abilities. And one of my favorite quotes from Arthur C. Clarke is that the most, actually, I'm going to get this quote wrong. Somebody can check on it. But sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Mm-hmm.
The early computer scientists were creating that sufficiently advanced technology, which is still indistinguishable from magic.
For most of us, yes.
Device here, this iPhone, this is magic to me. Okay. So the relationship between the occult and computer science should be obvious. People were magicians. One of the first servers was called Gandalf. This is something that I think merits some more investigation. But the occult subculture, especially in the Bay Area and especially in the computer science world, was quite vibrant, and it intersected with psychedelics and interest in the paranormal and UFOs and a whole host of other types of things. But this was a component of the cultic milieu that's important, which is why I think it's important to identify the internet and the World Wide Web in particular as the principal vehicle for spreading this cultic milieu, for spreading this scientific occultism, for fostering it in social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on TikTok, wherever, ChatGPT, AI applications. It has spread like wildfire. And part of that is because Graham Hancock's book, Fingerprints of the Gods, as I pointed out, came out the same year as Mosaic 1.0, Internet Explorer, Netscape Navigator, and word spread very, very quickly.
Indeed. Okay, we have time, I think, for 2 more questions. Jay, are you there? Molasses wants to know, John discussed his early embrace of pseudoarchaeology. Did he mention what caused him to abandon those beliefs?
Yeah, I skipped over that part. You may remember I talked about that paper that I wrote, the very first research paper that I ever wrote, which I was 14 and 15 years old. I started in 1973, and you all may remember what 1973 was like, but I started that paper as an Atlantis believer. I started that paper having read Donnelly and believed what it was that I read. I had read von Däniken, I'd read Charles Berlitz on the Bermuda Triangle, I'd read all kinds of stuff. I started the paper as an Atlantis believer. By the time I finished that paper, I was an archaeologist.
Whoa!
By the time I finished that paper, I had come around to a scientific, evidence-based interpretation of Atlantis. Actually, what I focused on was the explanation that it might have been the island of Santorini, which was a popular archaeological interpretation at the time, and that Atlantis has actually been Minoan civilization on Crete, which was destroyed by the tsunamis that had occurred as a result of the explosion of Santorini. That was what I concluded in my paper. But that particular paper represents the transition from my embrace of pseudoarchaeology to my embrace of archaeology. And I began reading books about the ancient Mayas and the ancient Aztecs, and the rest is history. That's when it happened.
That's great. What a wonderful origin story. I love it. So much. You overcame confirmation bias, John. Congratulations. Do you think Hancock believes his work, or is he just trying to sell books by being provocative?
That is the $64,000 question. I have gone back and forth and back and forth and back and forth almost on a daily basis while preparing this presentation. Is he just a charlatan who's trying to make money? Does he know what he's doing? And I believe that he believes what he's doing. I really do. I've come to that conclusion in part because I can't believe that someone can go on dozens of ayahuasca trips and continue to conceal a scam. I think it's very difficult for somebody to be honest with their loved ones and many people around them, and somehow keep the scam hidden. And Graham Hancock has been very consistent for 30 years.
Yeah.
It's very difficult for me to believe that someone could sustain that energy and that interest without that core belief. I believe that something happened with Graham Hancock where this particular reality became his core reality, and it's unshakable. And I don't think it will be shaken. I think he's going to go to the grave with this reality. And the fear, and actually a sad part of it, and I feel a lot of compassion for Graham Hancock, I really do, is that this particular belief may have come out of his very difficult experiences in Somalia and Ethiopia, or his very difficult personal family experiences. It's very difficult to say. But one of the things that he mentions in some of the interviews that are done with him after his books were published is that he feels that, in fact, the world's going to be destroyed, which is a very sad thing to be thinking about and to be preoccupied with your entire life, is that all of these things that we have and we value are going to be destroyed and may be destroyed soon. And I think that's something that he believes. And I feel very sorry for him, because I think that would be a very heavy burden to carry, the belief that the world is going to be destroyed by comets or whatever in the near future. It's troubling, but I think he really believes that.
Well, on that cheerful note, let me thank you for spending this evening with us and for giving us so much to think about, John. Bay Area Skeptics, thank you. I thank you. I think we've had a great night tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And for those of you watching, please do join us next month on April 13th for the Bay Area Skeptics SkepTalk. An hour earlier, we have an East Coast speaker, Brianna Popener. She's going to be speaking at 6:30 p.m., so set your alarms. Brianna is she's a staffer at the Smithsonian in the anthropology department. She specializes in taphonomy and in diet. And she's going to be talking about she's written a book on the paleo diet, actually. Did paleo people actually eat paleo? So bring your jerky strips and join us on Thursday, September 13th at 6:30. Same time, same station, BAS POBI on the bit.ly. See you then. Bye-bye.